The rhythm of my life in Astoria became the rhythm of the waves, predictable, cold, and ceaseless. After Mass, when the weight of the incense had finally lifted from my lungs, I often retreated to the Fisherman's Grotto, a dark, cheap diner smelling of stale coffee and desperation, just a few blocks from the dreary pier. It was here, amidst the muted clatter of plates and the harsh conversations of men who lived and died by the tides, that the air finally broke. The bell above the door chimed, a thin, tinny sound, but the presence that followed was anything but slight. She stepped out of the perpetual grey light and brought with her disruptive color. Her hair was a startling, heavy black that seemed to drink the meager light in the room, contrasting sharply with the pale, rain-slicked faces of the regulars. She wore a heavy leather jacket despite the season, and her eyes, when they scanned the room, were dark, liquid, and utterly dismissive of the environment she found herself in. Her name, I would learn, was Serafina. She did not belong in Astoria, she was a spark in a tinderbox of damp-wood. While everyone else wore the exhaustion of the Pacific Northwest, she wore the sharp, defiant confidence of a coastal storm that decides to break inland. She took the booth directly opposite mine, carelessly tossing a worn backpack onto the seat beside her. When the waitress, a woman named Agnes who measured out service and sympathy in equal, meager portions, approached, Serafina ordered a whiskey, neat, and ignored the time of day disapproval in Agnes's frown. I tried to return to my sketchbook, feigning immersion in the lines I was drawing, but the hollowness in my chest felt strangely pressurized by her proximity. She was the friction I had craved. She was the potential for bleeding. She didn't speak for a long time, just nursed her drink, her gaze drifting over the harbor view framed by the foggy window. But then, without warning, her eyes locked onto mine. There was no coyness or curiosity, only a cool, direct assessment. "You look like you're waiting for the world to end," she said, her voice a low contralto, rough at the edges, like old sandpaper. I stammered, unsure how to respond to such brutal honesty. I'm just sketching." She glanced down at my page, a half-finished drawing of St. Jude's spire, rendered impossibly heavy and dark. "No, you're not. You're waiting for an excuse to leave. You've got that lost sheep look. The kind they try to fix with prayer and hard work here." The accuracy stung. She had seen through my carefully constructed wall of cynicism and solitude in a single glance. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice barely audible above the low hum of the refrigerated counter. She smiled, a slow, predatory curve of the lips that made the dim light in the diner seem brighter. "Someone passing through. Someone who appreciates scenery, especially when the scenery is trying very hard to pretend it isn't miserable." She leaned forward, resting her chin on her hand, her expression turning challenging. "And you, Liam, are miserable. But you're bored with being miserable in the prescribed way." The fact that she knew my name, a small detail picked up, perhaps, from Eleanor's well-meaning and loud chatter at St. Jude's, didn't surprise me as much as the realization that she saw the potential for violence in my quietude. "And what way is that?" I pushed back, suddenly feeling a surge of that volatile heat I had been missing. "The quiet, self-pitying way," she whispered. "The kind that stays locked in the attic. I prefer the kind that burns the house down." She paused, took a sip of her whiskey, and then slid a small, intricately carved silver key across the worn tabletop toward me. It looked ancient, foreign, and faintly dangerous. "I'm staying at the old Seaman's Lodge down by the docks. Room 12. I need someone who knows this graveyard of a town to show me where the real history is buried. Not the sanitized version your boy Eleanor prays to." My hand instinctively closed around the key. It was cool and heavy, a tangible link to an immediate, unauthorized future. It smelled faintly of salt and a sharp, unfamiliar metallic scent. I knew, with the stark certainty of a man stepping over a cliff edge, that this key was not just for a room, it was the entry point into the storm. Eleanor's warning, the one about the devil finding purchase in empty chambers, was ringing loudly now, but the sound was quickly being drowned out by the sudden, intense vitality Serafina had injected into the suffocating silence. The void was beginning to fill, and it was filling with spiritual gunpowder. The air in the car shifted. The sweet scent of Serafina's perfume, which I had just mentally categorized as normal, was abruptly overlaid with a sharp, metallic odor, like ozone mixed with something deeply unpleasant, maybe burnt minerals. The fog wasn't just outside, it felt cold and thick inside the cab, clinging to the windows and muffling the sound of the engine. Then, a sudden, blinding flash of movement materialized directly in front of us, crossing the road with impossible speed, a deer, massive and spectral in the high beams. I slammed on the brakes, a clumsy, human reaction, but before the tires could even shriek, Serafina's hand shot out, not to steady herself, but to grip my forearm. The contact was not human. Her skin felt scorching, dry, and beneath her perfectly manicured nails, I felt a vibration, a tremor of latent, barely contained energy. The car stopped dead, not with a jarring lurch, but an instantaneous deceleration that defied physics. The deer was gone. I looked at the road, there were no skid marks. I stared at her, my carefully constructed disbelief collapsing into a heap of desperate terror. My pulse was hammering against the bone in my wrist where she had touched me. What was that? What did you do? Serafina simply smiled, and the smile held none of the prior night's warmth. It was the feral, contemptuous expression from the coffee shop, magnified tenfold. I maintained control, Liam. Something you seem incapable of doing. She leaned closer, her eyes blazing like molten topaz in the darkness, pulling the last oxygen from the car. You wanted the truth, darling. You've been sniffing around it like a dog at a locked door since the day we met. The facade required effort, and frankly, I'm exhausted by banality. She finally let go of my arm, and a wave of icy cold replaced the burning heat. I am not from Astoria, Liam. I am not human. The records you couldn't find. They were never meant to exist in this dimension. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the unspoken weight of centuries. My grandmother said you smelled of sulfur in abandoned churches, I whispered, the words tasting like ash. Serafina laughed, a dry, metallic sound that grated on my nerves. But Eleanor is predictable, but accurate. She recognizes the scent of spiritual gunpowder. I am what your kind used to call a principle. A fundamental error in the divine calculus. The fallen, if you prefer the dramatic term. She explained that she had been waiting, observing, drawn to the sharp fissure between my upbringing and my genuine nihilism. The date, the conversation, the brilliance, it was all calibration. I wanted to know if the beautiful architecture of your mind was worth corrupting entirely. And it is, Liam. It truly is. She elevated me, not with praise, but with the terrifying clarity of genuine, self-serving interest. She offered her hand again, this time gently, resting it on my jaw. Her touch was now simply warm, persuasive. You are tired of the light, aren't you? You rebelled for a reason. Come with me. Learn the real history of the world. Trade the stale praise of your lineage for infinite knowledge and unending presence. Her voice dropped to a seductive murmur, bypassing my ears and vibrating directly against the frantic rhythm of my heart. Tell me, Liam. After everything you've learned tonight, the missing years, the impossible stops, the scent of the truly ancient, are you still in love with the lie, or are you ready to embrace the magnificent truth? The ember gaze pinned me, demanding not just compliance, but willing, ecstatic surrender. I knew that answering yes meant severing every earthly tie and stepping permanently into the cold, thrilling vastness she represented, leaving the damp wool and tired faith of Astoria forever behind. My fear was still there, but it was now overshadowed by the intoxicating relief of finally belonging to a mystery worth dying for. The romance between Serafina and me had been a frantic, blinding sprint toward oblivion, but our last ride together, late that Thursday night on US Route 101 South, was defined by a terrifying, glacial stillness. We were far past Tillamook, where the Pacific surf slammed against black rock, and the highway curved inland, swallowed by monolithic stands of Douglas fir and relentless coastal fog. The air outside was thick, smelling of brine and damp earth, but the atmosphere inside my battered Ford Ranger was something else entirely. It was a cold that cut deeper than the Oregon winter, a chill that seemed to radiate directly from the passenger seat. For the first time since we met, Serafina was completely silent. Usually, she was a torrent, a rapid, intellectual force that discussed philosophy, ancient history, or the flaws in my grandmother's Catholic dogma with equal, ferocious passion. Now, she was a statue. I tried to speak, a joke about the oppressive darkness, a question about her upcoming non-existent classes, but the words died in my throat. She sat rigid, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her head tilted slightly forward. The street lights, few and far between, occasionally sliced through the cab, briefly illuminating her profile. Her skin, usually pale, now seemed translucent, stretched taut over high cheekbones. Her eyes, those magnificent pools of amber and green that had captivated me from the start, were wide open, yet completely unfocused, gazing past the windshield into a space that didn't exist in our dimension. Serafina. I finally managed, my voice sounding weak and foreign against the hum of the engine and the damp rush of the tires. No response. I reached out, my fingers brushing her gloved hand. Her skin was unnaturally cold, like porcelain left out in the snow. "Are you okay? You're freezing." She didn't flinch, didn't breathe. It was less like she was sleeping, and more like she had simply stopped functioning. The intense cold emanating from her side of the car grew stronger, forcing me to turn the heat up to an uncomfortable blast, which did nothing to combat the internal temperature drop. It felt as if a vacuum had opened up right next to me, sucking the warmth and noise out of the world. The stillness lasted maybe 5 minutes, but in that claustrophobic space, it felt like an eternity stretched thin over a breaking point. I was about to pull over, convinced she was having a medical emergency, when the silence shattered. It didn't shatter with a scream or a cough, it shattered with a mechanical, grinding click, the sound of bone shifting where bone should not shift. Her head snapped back against the headrest with a force that should have cracked her skull. I slammed the brakes instinctively, the tires skidding briefly on the damp asphalt of 101. The Ranger shuddered to a halt, engulfed immediately by the thick, choking fog. We were completely alone. I turned to her, my heart hammering against my ribs, convinced she was seizing. But she wasn't seizing. She was contorting. The first thing I registered was the eyes. Those vibrant amber irises rolled fully upward, disappearing completely, leaving behind only the sickly, yellowish-white sclera, now shot through with thin, dark red capillary lines, like tributaries of spilled blood. They weren't the eyes of a person in distress, they were the observation decks of a terrible void. Then came the sound. It began low, a terrible, wet rattle deep in her chest, like gravel being churned in oil. It intensified, rising in pitch until it wasn't noise, but language. It was guttural, ancient, and deeply terrifying, a symphony of friction and pain forced through a structure incapable of producing such tones. Her jaw unhinged. I watched, paralyzed by pure, visceral horror, as Seraphina's mouth opened impossibly wide. Her mandibles seemed to disconnect from the temporal bone, stretching the skin thin. The sound that erupted was not English, not Latin, and certainly not the Greek she sometimes quoted. It was a rhythmic, hammering chant of syllables that felt physically painful to hear, like pressure building behind my eardrums. It sounded like the roots of language, a proto-human roar that spoke of dust and sacrifice. I vaguely remembered a documentary about the earlier Semitic languages, about Aramaic. This was perhaps related, perhaps older, stripped of all human kindness, a chant of pure, agonizing eviction. It was the sound of a tenant protesting removal. The air inside the cab was now thick with the smell of ozone and something metallic, like burnt copper. The language hammered at the glass, vibrating the thin metal of the door. I finally broke free of my paralysis, driven by the instinct to survive this monstrous noise. I fumbled for the gear stick, trying to ram the car back into drive and flee, but my shaking hands missed the grip. Simultaneously, I reached for my phone, fumbling to dial 911. "Hello, 911, what is your emergency?" a calm female voice asked, cutting through the horrifying cacophony. "It's my passenger. She's having a fit. She's speaking something. I'm on 101 South, near the 34-mile marker. Please, send someone. She's hurting herself." I screamed, my voice barely audible over the relentless chanting that sounded increasingly like a desperate prayer to a very angry God. As I spoke, the intensity of the noise reached a crescendo. Seraphina's body convulsed violently against the seatbelt, a raw, inhuman strength coursing through her. I saw a streak of light, a faint, greenish glow, emanate from her mouth before the sound suddenly, jarringly, stopped. One moment, the cab was a pressure cooker of ancient agony and burning air, the next, it was instantly silent. The silence was absolute, a profound vacuum that swallowed even the echo of the engine. I dropped the phone, which landed silently on the carpet. I looked at Seraphina. Her jaw slowly, agonizingly, closed. Her eyes rolled back down, but they were no longer amber and lively, yet they were dull, sunken, and haunted. She looked utterly drained, as if the last 5 minutes had aged her by 50 years. She blinked, slowly, taking in the fog-drenched interior of the cab, then saw my face, pale, sweat-soaked, terrified. "Liam," she whispered, her voice frail and completely human, laced with confusion and profound exhaustion. "What happened? Where are we?" It was the Seraphina I knew, but her fear wasn't about me. It was raw, self-directed terror. She looked at her hands, which were trembling uncontrollably, then glanced down at her lap, her eyes widening in a sudden, silent panic that eclipsed even my own. She didn't look at me again. Before I could form a coherent sentence, before I could ask what that was or what she was, she ripped the seatbelt off. The door handle clicked. She threw herself out of the Ranger and into the heavy, suffocating darkness of the coastal woods. Serafina. Wait. I stumbled out, chasing after her, but the Oregon forest at night is an absolute, devouring darkness. The fog instantly swallowed her slight frame. I heard the snapping of a few small branches, then nothing. Only the sound of the surf somewhere in the distance and my own ragged breathing. The police arrived 40 minutes later. They found me hysterical, standing in the middle of US 101, screaming a name into the trees that sounded ridiculous even to my own ears. The deputy was bored, efficient, and immediately skeptical. There were no tracks, no sign of a struggle, only me, a college dropout clearly in a state of extreme emotional distress, claiming his beautiful girlfriend vanished while speaking an old dead language. They checked my blood alcohol level, 0, and ran my name clean. They logged the report for a missing person, a routine that felt dismissive and insulting. They treated me like a troubled kid whose date had simply bolted after a bad fight. I told them about the eyes, the jaw, the cold, but the words sounded insane. I sounded insane. They drove me back to Astoria in the back of the cruiser. My own truck was impounded briefly as part of the investigation. When I finally stumbled back into the oppressive silence of Eleanor's Victorian house, she was waiting. She didn't ask where I had been. She didn't ask what happened to Serafina. She merely looked at me with those ancient, tired eyes, her rosary beads clutched so tightly her knuckles were white. The air in her small sitting room, which always smelled of lavender and stale incense, felt heavy. The spirit has been expelled, Liam, she stated, her voice a low, gravelly whisper. You were foolish enough to let it close. But the good Lord, or perhaps the terrible host it occupied, could not sustain the deception any longer. I stared at her, horrified. What are you talking about, Bob? Serafina is gone. She needs help. No, boy, she cut me off sharply. It is gone. The host is likely wandering, empty, or has been retrieved. You cannot pray to what you do not understand. That girl was not a girl. She was a veil. She never mentioned Serafina again. The official police search lasted 2 days, yielding nothing but damp underbrush and bureaucratic frustration. Serafina simply ceased to have existed, a beautiful, terrifying mirage on the Oregon coast. A week later, I got my truck back from the impound lot. The police had treated it professionally, searching for evidence of blood or foul play, but found nothing. They'd even vacuumed the floor mats. The smell of ozone was still faint, however, clinging to the heavy, vinyl upholstery. I was cleaning out the cab, attempting the impossible task of erasing the memory of that night, when I saw it. It was on the passenger seat, right where Serafina's hip would have rested. I ran my hand across the seat, expecting condensation or maybe spilled coffee. But my fingers found not a stain, but a profound indentation. It was a burn mark. It wasn't a cigarette burn, those were small, circular, and contained. This was deep, branded into the heavy gray vinyl, melting the synthetic material and singeing the foam padding beneath it. The mark was a perfect, clean crescent moon shape, approximately 5 inches in length and 2 inches at its widest point. It looked like a searing hot branding iron had been pressed into the seat, generating enough heat to fuse the fibers. The smell of sulfur and superheated material was distinct and unmistakable. I pressed my finger into the indentation. The material was brittle and sharp at the edges. This was the evidence. This was the concrete proof that whatever had been in my car that night, whatever had occupied the body of the brilliant, beautiful Serafina, had been something physical enough, and hot enough, to scar the world. The police had missed it, dismissing it as heat damage or wear and tear. But I knew. Serafina had left no tracks in the forest, no hair, no fingerprints, but she had left a scar of impossible, unearthly heat right next to me. I never told anyone about the crescent mark. I sold the Ford Ranger a month later to a scrap dealer for pennies, claiming the transmission was failing. I couldn't stand to sit next to the physical proof that the things Eleanor preached about, the things that twist and possess and burn, were completely real, and that they had chosen me, however briefly, as their unwilling witness. The coastal fog of Astoria had simply provided the perfect, silent stage for the demonic to make its entrance and its violent, fiery exit. The green light was not diffused by the blizzard, it seemed to cut through it, a perfect vector of pure color in a world of blinding white. It pulsed slowly, deliberately, without the irregular scatter of aircraft beacons or the warm flicker of combustion. It was the color of deep-sea phosphorescence and sterile laboratory light, utterly foreign to the high desert night. Alex instinctively reached for the Nikon, a reflex honed by years of documenting the weird and remote, but the camera felt heavy and inadequate. What good was capturing a frequency when the frequency itself felt like a threat? Alex tried to rationalize it, a rogue searchlight, an experimental military drone, perhaps a meteorological phenomenon amplified by the snow. Yet, the light carried none of the telltale scattering that particulate matter should inflict. It was unnervingly sharp, a solid pillar of color. The rationalizations dissolved completely when the light moved, confirming Alex's dread that this was not a distant, fixed installation. It traversed the terrain with a smooth, impossible speed, ignoring the drifts and the unseen ruts of the wilderness. It was covering the distance of half a mile in mere seconds. Alex felt the truck shudder, not from the wind, but from a sudden, sharp pressure drop outside, a momentary stillness in the maelstrom that suggested a massive object was displacing the air around them. The blizzard, the great, insulating roar, was momentarily choked off, replaced by a dense, electrical hum that vibrated the fillings in Alex's teeth. Solitude had been the honest witness, but now Alex realized it was also the trap. In the total absence of civilization, there were no established rules, no context for defense. This was beyond the manageable terrors of geology or extreme weather, this was intelligence intersecting with indifference. The sheer inhumanity of the approaching light was forcing Alex to confront the vertical world they had fled, the realm of intangible dread, of things that existed beyond the physical plane. If the horizontal world of rock and dust offered no buffer against this, then perhaps the vastness was merely an altar waiting for sacrifice. The light stopped less than 50 feet away, just outside the perimeter of the truck's useless headlights. It flooded the front of the Ford F-150, turning the snow and the metal into a sickly, radioactive green. The air was now thick with the scent of ozone and something colder, something metallic and sharp, like frozen iron. Alex squinted, pressing their face against the frost-covered side window, trying to see the source. The light wasn't coming from a single point, it seemed to emanate from the entire volume of a colossal, smooth object. And then, as the green light dimmed slightly, gathering itself, Alex saw the shape it illuminated, not the object itself, which remained shrouded in the shifting, unnatural quiet, but the ground beneath it. The snow cover had been swept away in a perfect, geometric circle, revealing the frozen dirt and sagebrush in a way that defied the chaotic forces of the raging blizzard. And imprinted in that clear dirt, incredibly deep, was the shadow of something vast and utterly silent. It was not resting, it was hovering. The green pulsed one final time, and Alex felt an unbearable pressure against their temples, the sound of the world being simultaneously compressed and pulled taut, just before the truck's remaining systems, the dash clock, the internal LED light, flickered violently and died, plunging Alex into absolute, echoing darkness. They were alone with the silence, and the silence was now occupied. The tallest being, the central axis of this terrible geometry, leaned forward, its head tilting again. It was a movement of acutely cold calculation, not curiosity. The green light emanating from its forearm module intensified, bathing the driver's side window in a searing, emerald glare. Alex realized the light wasn't just illumination, it was active, a probing energy. A faint, high-pitched whine began, too high to be heard by the ear, yet vibrating deep in the teeth and bones. The sound stopped abruptly, replaced by the profound, invasive silence. The central figure pulled its arm back. The SUV's passenger door, which Alex knew was double-locked, did not open in a standard fashion. The metal and composite material didn't grind or squeak, instead, the doorframe simply unsealed, the edges of the chassis parting without visible force or sound, peeling back like thick foil. The interior lights did not come on. The entity reached a long, stick-like appendage into the dark cavity, moving with slow, meticulous precision, exploring the space where Alex had just been sitting. It was searching for something specific, perhaps a heat signature, or the lingering energy of the battery, or merely evidence of the human occupancy. The sudden vulnerability of the metal tomb, now compromised so easily, sent a fresh wave of panic through Alex, quickly overshadowed by a cold, desperate resolve. The creatures were focused. This was the only window. The world might freeze, but the documentation could not. Alex carefully pulled the professional-grade DSLR from the bag. The thin blanket offered minimal muffling, but it was better than nothing. The settings were already optimized for low-light, high-contrast shooting. The flash was disabled, the green wrist devices provided more than enough synthetic luminescence. Targeting the central figure's arm and the blocky module, Alex braced the camera against the cold sand and inhaled slowly. The need to capture proof overcame the instinct for total silence. Alex engaged the silent shutter mode. The mechanism produced a faint, muted cluck, a tiny, mechanical heartbeat swallowed almost entirely by the heavy thermal fabric. The central figure froze instantly. Its elongated form, previously focused entirely on the interior of the SUV, snapped upright with impossible speed. Its head, long and narrow, pivoted directly toward the mass of basalt. There was no hesitation, no searching, only a terrifying, undeniable acknowledgement of Alex's presence. The two flanking figures turned in perfect, silent unison. The three green lights converged, focusing their intense, synthetic beams like accusatory fingers directly at the hiding spot. The time for observation was over. Alex scrambled deeper into the massive rock formation, forgetting all caution, fueled by the immediate threat. The volcanic rock offered sharp, frozen edges and treacherous footing. The camera bag snagged violently on a jagged shard of oxidized basalt. Alex ripped the strap free, hearing the canvas tear, a sound instantly devoured by the environment. The vacuum silence shattered. The wind returned with a sudden, overwhelming violence, screaming through the high desert, whipping the dry snow into a blinding fury. It felt like the storm itself was responding to the presence of the entities. Alex risked a glance back. The three dark figures were no longer gliding slowly. They moved now with unnerving speed, flowing over the knee-deep drifts as if the ground were perfectly flat and the hurricane force wind irrelevant. The snow swirled wildly around them, but their matte black forms remained crisp, untouched by the blizzard. They were not running, they were simply arriving. Alex plunged down a narrow, ice-slicked crevice, a sudden, vertical drop offering a chance to utilize the sheer terrain of Crocodilus. The goal was descent and disorientation. The tall, impossibly elongated shadow of the leading entity stretched across the upper lip of the formation as the green light washed over the face of the rock. Alex slammed into the icy sand at the bottom of the fissure, the cold a sharp, physical agony. Survival depended not on remaining still, but on relentless, silent forward motion away from that sickly, unnatural glow. The wind, a howling vortex of ice and particulate snow, swallowed all sound. It was an overwhelming, crushing presence, yet somehow, Alex noticed the absence of sound beneath it. The three figures were approaching the stranded Jeep Cherokee, and they made no noise of their own. They did not walk. They glided. In the brief, eerie gaps between the wind's most vicious gusts, Alex squinted through the granite outcrop. The figures, tall and obscenely thin beneath their dark, clinging outerwear, seemed to float half an inch above the accumulating drifts. There was no crunch, no displacement, no telltale foe in the snow that should mark the passing of a creature weighing anything substantial. They were ghosts given impossible physical form. They reached the Jeep, surrounding it with an unnerving, deliberate geometry. The sickly green light emanating from their wrist-mounted devices pulsed faintly, casting brief, unnatural highlights across the ice-coated vehicle. Alex watched the tallest figure, the one standing perhaps 7 feet tall, reach out a hand toward the driver's side window. Alex's breath hitched, turning instantly into a frozen mist in the frigid air. He clamped a gloved hand over his mouth, burying his face deeper into the sharp, unforgiving texture of the rock. He prayed that the blizzard's white noise and the granite's shadow were enough to conceal the heat radiating from his terrified body. The action that followed was not one of violence or aggression, but one of cold, detached examination. The three figures began to methodically inspect the vehicle. It was not a search for keys or valuables, it was a biological survey. They circled the Jeep slowly, their movements synchronized, almost liturgical. The tallest figure returned to the driver's side. Its hand, long, thin, ending in 3 prominent, spatulate fingers, did not attempt to pry the door open or shatter the glass. Instead, it began to tap. 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 The sound was shockingly clear, a precise, high-frequency resonance cutting through the wind's low roar. It sounded metallic and hollow, as if the creature's fingers were not bone and flesh, but some hard, ceramic material. Alex could visualize the scene perfectly, the creature's large, helmet-like head tilting slightly as the green light scanned the glass. It was as if they were performing percussion on the vehicle, listening for a specific echo or density within the cab. They were treating his ruined Jeep not as an abandoned conveyance, but as an intact cocoon from which the insect inside had just managed to escape. The tapping continued, shifting across the windshield, then the side window. Alex was gripped by a terror so profound it sterilized his mind of all complex thought. He was reduced to a primal function, do not move. Do not breathe too loud. He could see the creature's profile now, close enough that the detail was horrifyingly clear, the complete lack of neck, the seamless merger of head and shoulder, and the sheer emptiness where eyes should be. Yet, he knew they were seeing everything. The green light wasn't illumination, it was active scanning. They spent 15 minutes, 15 interminable centuries, probing every joint, every crease, every seal of the Jeep. They paused at the small gap where the window wasn't quite sealed due to the ice, and the metal figure extended a slender appendage, perhaps a sensor, into the interior, withdrawing it almost instantly. They seemed satisfied that their subject was indeed absent. The two shorter figures began radiating outward from the Jeep, executing broad, geometric sweeps of the immediate area. They were hunting. The tallest figure remained by the Jeep, its attention seemingly drawn to the snow-covered ground where Alex had frantically dragged himself out just minutes before. The creature shifted its weight, a fluid, unsettling movement, and its massive frame straightened to its full height. It stopped scanning the ground. It turned its featureless face and directed its attention not at the car, or at the tire tracks, but directly at the gnarled rock formation where Alex was hiding. The green light on its wrist suddenly intensified, becoming a razor-sharp beam that sliced through the swirling white flakes. It held the beam steady, bathing the granite outcrop in an acidic, hostile glow. A wave of crushing despair washed over Alex. They knew. They had known all along. The creature made no sound, offered no warning. Instead, it raised its free arm. There was no visible weapon, but a sudden, high-pitched whine emanated from the wrist device, followed by a violent, concussive crack that seemed to momentarily deafen the blizzard. The shot was fired upward, tearing a hole through the curtain of falling snow. The sound wasn't the dull retort of a conventional firearm, it was sharper, cleaner, vibrating deep in Alex's chest cavity. It was a shot designed not to kill, but to communicate. "We see you. Come out." Alex instinctively pushed himself deeper into the rock, scraping his cheek against the frozen stone. The burning terror now mixed with a desperate, animal anger. He was not going to be retrieved and catalogued. The two shorter figures instantly converged back towards the rock formation, their green wrist beams weaving intricate, overlapping patterns across the snow. The silence of their movement magnified the terror. They were close enough now that Alex could hear the faint, low hum emanating from their garments, a sound like high-tension wires resonating in the wind. The tallest figure began a slow, methodical advance, its steps still unnaturally soundless. Alex fumbled inside his heavy coat, fingers frozen and clumsy, until they closed around the slim form of his satellite phone. He knew the signal was utterly non-existent in the high desert storm, but the desperate need for human contact overruled all logic. He dialed 911. The phone screen showed no service, but Alex pressed the call button anyway. A moment later, the familiar, mechanical voice of the operator's recording crackled to life, distorted by static. "Welcome to the Nevada emergency." Alex pressed the phone to his mouth, speaking in a harsh, barely audible whisper, terrified that the harvesters might hear the human sound. "I need help," he rasped, his voice raw. "I'm on 95, just south of Imlay. 3 figures, not human. They're shooting. They're trying to BZZZZZT." The phone died. The screen went dark, killed by the cold, the signal interference, or perhaps something else entirely. Alex stared at the inert device, his final tether to the sane world severed. One of the shorter figures was now mere feet away from the outcrop. Alex could hear its mechanical hum clearly. The green light swept over the patch of snow directly in front of him. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to make himself thinner, smaller, willing the granite to absorb him. The figure paused. It tilted its head, a motion that spoke volumes. It sensed him, but perhaps couldn't visually confirm his presence in the shifting snow. The creature was about to move around the edge of the granite and discover Alex when a sound, a pure, human sound, cut through the chaos of the storm. A siren. Distant, wavering, choked by the massive snowstorm, but undeniably a police siren, approaching from the south on Highway 95. The effect on the 3 figures was instantaneous and absolute. They stopped their search patterns mid-sweep. The hum from their suits abruptly ceased. The intense green beams dimmed to a dull, passive glow. They converged rapidly toward the Jeep, their silent gliding movements accelerating dramatically. They didn't look threatened, they looked interrupted. Like doctors whose important surgical procedure had been halted by a fire alarm. They gathered directly behind the abandoned vehicle. Alex watched, heart hammering against his ribs, as the tallest figure gave a quick, almost dismissive gesture with its 3-fingered hand. Then, they were gone. Not running, not ascending, not stepping away. They were simply replaced by the blizzard. One moment, 3 impossible figures stood against the white backdrop, the next, there was only the swirling, empty snow. The disappearance was simultaneous, immediate, and utterly impossible by any physical law known to humanity. It was as if their presence was a switch that had just been flipped off. The distant siren grew louder, more defiant. Alex remained paralyzed for several minutes, shivering uncontrollably, not solely from the cold, but from the visceral shock of what he had witnessed. When he finally forced his cramped limbs to move, he crawled stiffly out from behind the rock, his focus locked on the approaching, flashing blue and red lights. The Nevada Highway Patrol SUV pulled up beside the Jeep, its heavy-duty plow kicking up massive drifts. A tall, grim-faced officer named Barnes emerged, followed by a younger partner. They looked tired, unsurprised by the sight of a city slicker stranded in a flash blizzard. "We got a vague 911 ping," Barnes said, his voice flat, his breath steaming in the brutal air. "Said you had vehicle trouble. You alright, son?" Alex stumbled toward them, trying to articulate the unbelievable, the sheer, paralyzing horror of the last hour. There were 3 of them, Alex gasped, his teeth chattering. They weren't people. Tall, silent. They shot at me. They were examining the car, like specimens. Officer Barnes exchanged a quick, knowing look with his partner, the kind of look that said, another one frozen out of his mind. "Listen, mister." "Alex," Barnes said, placing a firm, stabilizing hand on Alex's shoulder. "It's 10 degrees out here, you're clearly hypothermic. Folks see a lot of things in the high desert, especially when the cold sets in. It was probably a snow drift or a flash of light." "It was not a drift," Alex insisted, pointing toward the still visible trail leading to the granite outcrop. "They were using green lights. They tapped on my window." Barnes sighed. "We'll file a report, okay? Now let's get you inside the unit and warm up before you lose any toes." Alex was defeated by the sheer banality of their professionalism. They weren't dismissing him with anger, but with tired resignation. They had seen this before. They knew the desert contained things that broke the minds of outsiders, and their job was to clean up the broken remnants. As he was being escorted toward the patrol car, Alex paused at the driver's side of his Jeep. He reached for his camera bag, pulling it free from the floorboard. He needed something, anything, to ground himself. And then he saw it. The police floodlights, mounted on the patrol SUV, illuminated the windshield with harsh clarity, cutting through the residual flakes. Directly in the center, at the point where the tallest figure had conducted its strange, rhythmic tapping, was the evidence. It was not condensation, nor ice, nor dirt. Pressed against the outer surface of the glass was a print, dried and frozen, of a massive, 3-fingered hand. The print was elongated, the fingers tapered unnaturally. It wasn't flat like a human palm, it had a slight dome, indicating a massive grip pad. The material was the most horrifying part. It looked like an amber-colored, viscous residue that had instantly flash-frozen upon contact with the glass. It had a strange, hard sheen, like solidified tree sap, but felt sleek and slightly tacky to the touch. Alex's photographer instinct took over. He pulled his smaller, backup DSLR from his bag, ignoring the officer's calls. He raised the camera, focused on the print, and fired the shutter repeatedly. Click. 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 He took macro shots, wide shots, detail shots, preserving the proof against the clinical denial of the mundane world. "What are you doing?" Officer Barnes demanded, walking towards him. "This is it," Alex whispered, his voice trembling not from cold, but from profound vindication. "This is what they left." Before Barnes could reach him, the extreme cold and the fragility of the substance won. With a faint, sickening shhhhhh, a hairline crack developed across the frozen amber print. A few seconds later, the entire thing fractured, crumbling into a fine, crystalline dust that was instantly snatched away by the unrelenting Nevada wind. When Officer Barnes finally looked at the spot Alex was pointing to, the windshield was clean. "Just ice, son," the officer said firmly, though his eyes lingered a second too long on the exact spot, perhaps seeing the faint, circular outline where the heat of the print had briefly melted the surface. "Let's go. We have to clear the road before you freeze solid." Alex didn't argue. He knew what he had seen. And he knew what his memory card held. He climbed into the heated patrol car, sinking into the blessed warmth, clutching his camera bag like a talisman. He had survived the examination, but the encounter had left him with a terrifying, undeniable truth: they were not accidents of the landscape. They were purposeful, alien, and they saw the world, and everything in it, merely as objects to be studied and catalogued. And they knew precisely where he lived. The silence that swallowed the interstate's roar was dense and heavy, like thick, cold honey. Chloe shivered, not just from the unexpected Kansas chill, but from the sudden absence of background noise, which had been masking the exhaustion in her ears. "Did you notice that pickup?" Dana muttered, pulling her jacket tighter. "It's the only vehicle, and it's parked sideways, almost blocking the entrance." "Just keep walking," Chloe whispered back, her gaze fixed on the bright red and yellow gas and crab sign. Every instinct honed by 18 hours of hypervigilance screamed at her to return to the relative safety of the highway, but the desperate need for real coffee, not lukewarm chemical sludge, overrode caution. They crossed the cracked asphalt parking lot, their footsteps echoing unnaturally loud against the backdrop of the humming fluorescence. The convenience store's glass doors were the sliding kind, the type that usually announce entry with a cheery, automated ding-dong. These doors slid open soundlessly, revealing an interior that was both pristine and disturbing. The shelves were fully stocked, too fully stocked. Cans were stacked with military precision, and the snack aisle was a dizzying kaleidoscope of color, yet the air was stale, carrying the faint, oxidized scent of dust mixed with cheap aerosol cleaner. It felt like walking into a museum exhibit of a 1990s truck stop, meticulously preserved but waiting for the life to return. A single figure stood behind the counter, leaning forward with his elbows propped on the magazine rack. He was a man in his late 50s, maybe early 60s, with a face that looked permanently windburned and eyes that seemed to have absorbed too much prairie sun, pale, faded blue, and unsettlingly vacant. He wore a faded blue work shirt that bore the generic stitch patch of Oasis employee. He didn't greet them. He simply watched them enter, his head tilting infinitesimally, like a sensor reacting to movement. "Hi," Chloe said, forcing a cheerful energy into her voice. "Where's the coffee?" The man didn't point or speak. He pushed off the counter and walked slowly, silently, around the corner of the aisle, disappearing from view. Dana grabbed Chloe's arm. "Did you see that?" He didn't say anything. He just moved. "Maybe he's just tired," Chloe rationalized, though her heart was hammering against her ribs. "Long shift. Let's just grab the biggest cup of black sludge they have and pay." They followed the soundless attendant. He was standing by a cluster of thermos dispensers, all labeled clearly, regular, decaf, hazelnut. The area was spotless. The coffee aroma, however, was strangely muted. "Help yourselves," the man droned, his voice flat and low, like water draining down a pipe. He didn't make eye contact, his gaze was fixed on a point directly above their heads. Chloe picked the regular dispenser and pushed the lever. Nothing happened. She pushed harder. Still nothing. She tried the hazelnut. The same dry silence. "Are these empty?" she asked, turning to the attendant. He tilted his head further. "They're always full." "Well, they aren't now," Dana interjected, exasperated. "Look, we're just driving through. Is there fresh pot brewing?" The man smiled then, a slow, unnatural pulling of the lips that didn't reach his eyes. "You don't need the coffee yet. You need the quiet. That's why you stopped, isn't it?" A wave of profound unease washed over Chloe. It felt like he hadn't asked a question, but stated a fact about their deepest, most desperate motivation. "We need to get to Denver," Chloe said sharply, moving toward the refrigerated drinks case. "We just need fuel. Car fuel, human fuel, bathroom break. That's all." She grabbed 2 enormous bottles of highly caffeinated iced tea and headed back to the counter, Dana trailing close behind. The attendant had returned to his original spot, resting his elbows on the magazine rack, observing them with that unsettling, fixed stare. As Chloe placed the bottles on the counter, she noticed the magazines beneath his arms were yellowed and curled at the edges, issues of Life and Reader's Digest from years, maybe decades, ago. They were not for sale, they were displays of frozen time. "That'll be $27.50, he announced, the price exorbitant even for 2 energy drinks. Chloe didn't argue. She fumbled with her credit card, sliding it into the reader. The screen flickered, displaying the words "processing." "Please wait." The silence returned, intense and immediate, broken only by the low, continuous strum of the old fluorescent tubes above. "You folks are running hard," the attendant said conversationally, but the tone made the statement sound like an accusation. "Running from the chaos. Trying to get to the altitude. That's the goal," Dana snapped, urging Chloe to hurry. "We just need this to go through." "Oh, it'll go through," the attendant assured them. "Everything goes through here, eventually. Traveler's Oasis. It's what we do. We offer a quiet place for those running on empty." A reset. Chloe snatched her card back the moment the machine chirped approved. She didn't wait for a receipt, pulling Dana toward the door. "Thank you," Chloe called out, her voice rushing. "Safe travels," the man replied, but as they reached the sliding doors, he added, his voice ringing slightly louder in the vacuum of the store, "Don't run too fast, now. Wouldn't want you to lose anything important on the way." They burst out of the store and into the cold night air. The relief of being outside lasted only a second before the familiar, potent feeling of scrutiny returned. "The bathroom," Dana whispered urgently. "We still need the bathroom." "Forget it," Chloe hissed, dragging her toward the Ford. "We are leaving now. That guy knows too much, and he looked like he hadn't blinked since the Reagan administration." As they scrambled into the car, throwing the energy drinks onto the back seat, Chloe glanced toward the back of the store, where the single dusty Ford pickup was still parked askew. Suddenly, the driver's side door of the truck swung open, casting a long shadow under the harsh yellow lights. Chloe didn't wait to see who emerged. She slammed the car door shut, shoved the key into the ignition, and the engine roared to life, shattering the silence of Traveler's Oasis. She threw the shifter into reverse, tires squealing briefly on the asphalt before she slammed it into drive, peeling out of the lot and back onto the crumbling two-lane road without looking back. "Go, go, go," Dana yelled, fumbling with her seatbelt, her eyes wide as saucers. They sped toward the black ribbon of the interstate, the garish lights of the Oasis shrinking rapidly behind them. It was only when they hit the ramp, merging back onto the featureless highway, that Chloe allowed herself a shaky breath. "What was that place?" Dana whispered, clutching her chest. "A bad idea," Chloe managed, gripping the wheel until her knuckles bleached white again. "Just corn, ethanol, and Jesus billboards from here on out. I swear I will never complain about monotony again." The sheer emptiness of the Kansas plains was no longer suffocating, it was a vast, comforting anonymity. They drove for 15 miles in silence, the air in the car thick with adrenaline and unspent fear. Then, Dana slowly turned around, shining a phone flashlight into the back seat to locate her energy drink. "Chloe," she said, her voice shaking violently. "The map. Look at the map." Chloe risked a glance at the GPS screen glowing on the dashboard. The blue line tracing the journey showed the highway, the brief detour onto the two-lane road, and the location dot marking Traveler's Oasis. The name Traveler's Oasis was still there, a bold dot 5 miles off the interstate. But surrounding the dot, where the local roads, the diner, and the store should have been marked, the map was completely blank. There were no connecting lines, no street names, nothing but the coordinates and the name. It was as if they had exited the mapped world, driven across 5 miles of featureless territory, stopped at a point designated only by title, and then returned. "There are no roads to it," Chloe said, her voice barely audible. "And look at this," Dana continued, her breathing hitching as she held up her phone. She pointed the camera at the back seat where Chloe had tossed the energy drinks. The drinks were there, but sitting between the two large bottles, resting neatly on the worn upholstery, was a single, folded piece of paper, pristine white, stuck against the dark fabric. Neither of them had seen it. Neither of them had touched it. It had not been there when